The date was September 12th, a Thursday. In the small, forgotten town of Willow Creek, the morning air was thick and heavy, carrying the scent of pine and impending rain. But it was the crows that everyone remembered later. Dozens of them flying low and silent, their black wings almost brushing the rooftops of Main Street. They were a bad omen, a silent, feathered jury delivering a verdict before the trial had even begun. My name is Chloe Peterson, and I was the waitress at the Creek-side diner. I poured the coffee that fueled the final, frantic day of our town's existence. What I saw, what I heard, it was the story of how a community bound by generations of trust systematically devoured itself. By nightfall, the crows were gone, but no one in Willow Creek was left standing. This is how it happened. The bell above the diner door chimed its familiar tinny song at 6:05 a.m., announcing the first customer of the day. It was Frank Henderson, a man whose face was a road map of sun and worry. He owned 100 acres of farmland just north of town, land his family had worked since Willow Creek was nothing more than a trading post. He slid into his usual booth, the one with the cracked red vinyl, and didn't even look at the menu I placed in front of him. "Just coffee, Chloe. Black." He rasped, his voice rough as gravel. "Tough morning, Frank?" I asked already, turning to grab a mug. He just grunted, staring out the large plate glass window at the unnaturally dark sky. The crows were out there, circling the town square, their movements sluggish and deliberate. It was unsettling. Birds were supposed to chirp and flutter. These birds moved with the grim purpose of undertakers. Willow Creek wasn't a place for drama. It was a town of routines, held together by the predictable rhythm of seasons and Sunday sermons. The biggest news in the last 5 years was when the old Miller barn had burned down, and even that was suspected to be insurance fraud, a topic of hushed gossip that died out after a month. But for the past few weeks, an undercurrent of something else had been humming just beneath the surface, a low-grade, anxious energy that clung to people like the damp morning air. The source of that energy had a name, the Willow Creek Revival Fund. The bell chimed again. This time, it was Mayor Robert Thompson, beaming as if he personally commanded the sun to rise. He was a handsome man, in his late 50s, with a politician's perfect teeth and a way of clapping you on the shoulder that felt both friendly and dismissive. "Chloe, my dear, a beautiful morning to build a future." He boomed, his voice filling the quiet diner. He winked at Frank Henderson, who pointedly ignored him and took a loud slurp of his coffee. The mayor's smile didn't falter. He was a master of ignoring unpleasantness. "The usual, Mayor?" I asked. "You know it, and add a side of that optimism I see in your eyes. Big things are happening for us. Big things." His usual was a Western omelette with extra cheese and a side of wheat toast, no butter. He was watching his cholesterol. He always said a statement so at odds with his grand pronouncements that it felt like a private joke. The Revival Fund was his brainchild. A year ago, he had gathered the townsfolk in the high school gymnasium. He spoke of revitalizing Main Street, of attracting tourism, of building a small boutique hotel on the old lumber mill property. He spoke of a new Willow Creek one, where our children wouldn't have to leave to find opportunities. All they had to do was invest. He had partnered with a firm, Sterling Equity Partners, he called them, and promised returns that seemed almost too good to be true. And people bought in. Frank Henderson had mortgaged a portion of his land. My boss, a kind but naive man named George, had sunk his life savings into it. The Gables, an elderly couple who owned the antique shop, invested their retirement. Nearly everyone with a spare dollar had handed it over to Mayor Thompson, and his vision their trust in him as solid and old as the oak trees in the town square. I hadn't invested, not because I was smart, but because I was broke. Every dollar I made from tips went into a shoebox under my bed, my escape fund. My dream wasn't revitalizing Willow Creek. It was seeing the "Welcome to Willow Creek" sign in my rearview mirror. Sheriff Brody ambled in around 7:30 a.m. He was a big man gone soft around the middle, just 2 years from retirement. He moved slowly, deliberately, as if the world might break if he rushed. "Morning, Bob," he said, nodding to the mayor. "Frank?" "Jim," the mayor replied cheerfully. Frank just grunted again. "Something's got the crows spooked," Brody said, settling onto a stool at the counter and looking out the window. "Haven't seen them fly this low since the big flood of '98. "They're birds of opportunity, Jim," the mayor said, wiping his mouth with a napkin. "They sense the winds of change. They know prosperity is coming to Willow Creek." Sheriff Brody just shook his head slowly and ordered his coffee. I spent the next hour refilling mugs, taking orders, and listening. The diner was the town's confessional, its switchboard, its central nervous system. I heard Mrs. Gable telling the postman, David, that her first dividend check from the fund was late. I heard 2 construction workers who were supposed to be breaking ground on the hotel, complaining that their contracts were still pending. Little whispers, little dissonant notes in the town's familiar melody. Around 9 a.m., Ben Carter came in. He was a mechanic from the auto shop down the road, a few years older than me. He had grease under his fingernails that never seemed to wash out, and kind, tired eyes. He wasn't from Willow Creek originally. He'd moved here 5 years ago to take care of his ailing grandmother, who had since passed. Like me, he was an observer, not a participant. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said, taking the stool next to Sheriff Brody. "Just the crows," I said, pouring him a coffee. "And the general mood." "Yeah," he said, lowering his voice. "Old man Henderson was over at the shop yesterday, asking what his 008 Ford F-150 is worth. Said he might need cash fast. He looked desperate, Chloe." I glanced over at Frank's booth. He was staring into his empty mug, his knuckles white. The jovial mask Mayor Thompson wore was starting to look less like confidence and more like a performance. A strain was showing at the corners of his eyes. The stillness of the morning wasn't peace. It was the held breath before a scream. It was the silent, terrifying moment when you realize you're falling, but haven't yet hit the ground. The crows knew. They were just waiting for the rest of us to figure it out. The morning was slipping away, and with every tick of the diner clock, the foundation of Willow Creek was crumbling, completely unseen, right under our feet. The morning rush subsided into the mid-morning lull. A few regulars lingered over their 3rd cups of coffee, the conversation now muted, revolving around weather patterns and high school football. The tension from the early morning had seemingly dissipated, like mist burning off in the sun. But it was still there, a low hum beneath the floorboards. Mayor Thompson had left shortly after finishing his breakfast, clapping Sheriff Brody on the back and reminding everyone to keep the faith. His exit felt like a release of pressure, but the unease he'd papered over remained. Frank Henderson hadn't moved from his booth. He just sat there, ordering coffee after coffee, his silence growing heavier and more menacing with each passing hour. I was wiping down the counter when the bell chimed again, this time with a frantic jangle. It was Eleanor Gable, a tiny woman with bird-like features and a reputation for knowing everything about everyone. She ran the Willow Creek Historical Society, But her real occupation was information broker. She clutched her purse to her chest like a shield. "Chloe, dear," she said, her voice a reedy whisper. "Is the sheriff still here?" I nodded towards the end of the counter, where Jim Brodie was slowly working his way through a crossword puzzle. Eleanor scurried over. "Jim," she said, her voice tight with panic. "I tried calling the number for Sterling Equity Partners, the one on the prospectus Robert gave us. It's been disconnected." Sheriff Brodie looked up from his puzzle, his placid expression barely changing. "Probably just a technical issue, Eleanor. You know how these city firms are, always changing offices." "But my dividend check is 2 weeks late," she pressed, "and David at the post office said 3 other families have been asking him about theirs. This isn't right." "Now, Eleanor, let's not start a panic," Brodie said, his tone paternalistic and condescending. "Robert Thompson has known your family for 40 years. He wouldn't steer you wrong." It was the classic Willow Creek response appeal to history, to familiarity, to the ingrained belief that people you know are incapable of true malice. But I saw the flicker of doubt in Eleanor's eyes before she nodded uncertainly and retreated from the diner. Her shoulders slumped. Brodie went back to his crossword, but he wasn't filling in any more boxes. He was just staring at the black and white squares. The crack came at precisely 11:47 a.m. Mayor Thompson's sleek black sedan pulled up outside the diner. He wasn't coming in. He was meeting someone, a man in an expensive suit. Too expensive for Willow Creek, got out of a rental car and joined the mayor on the sidewalk. They spoke in low, urgent tones, the man in the suit gesturing wildly, while the mayor held up his hands in a placating gesture. I couldn't hear their words through the glass, but I could read the language of desperation. The mayor's confident mask was gone, replaced by a pallor of sheer panic. And Frank Henderson saw it too. He rose from his booth so quickly that his chair scraped backward with a violent screech. Every head in the diner snapped towards him. He threw a $5 bill on the table and strode towards the door, his movements stiff with rage. He burst out onto the sidewalk. "Thompson!" he roared. The sound cut through the quiet street like a gunshot. The mayor and the man in the suit froze. "Where's our money, Robert?" Frank yelled, his voice cracking with emotion. "You told us it was safe. You promised us." "Frank, please, this isn't the time or the place," the mayor stammered, trying to regain his composure. "We're just sorting out some logistical hurdles." "Logistical hurdles?" Frank laughed, a bitter, ugly sound. "Is that what you call it when the phone number's disconnected? Is that what you call it when my friends in the city tell me Sterling Equity Partners filed for bankruptcy a month ago? You lied to us." The man in the suit shot the mayor a venomous look, muttered something and practically ran back to his rental car, speeding away and leaving a puff of dust in his wake. Now it was just the mayor and the farmer, a showdown on Main Street. Inside the diner, we were all frozen watching the tableau unfold. This was more than a disagreement. This was the violation of a sacred, unspoken pact. "You need to calm down," the mayor said, his voice regaining a sliver of its authoritative tone. "You're making a scene." "A scene?" Frank's voice dropped to a dangerous low growl. "I mortgaged my grandfather's land for your vision, Robert. My son can't go to college now. The bank sent me a foreclosure notice this morning. You didn't just take my money. You took my family's future. You took everything." Sheriff Brodie was finally on his feet, moving with uncharacteristic speed towards the door. "All right, Frank, that's enough," he said, stepping between them. But Frank wasn't looking at the sheriff. His eyes, filled with a terrible broken light, were locked on the mayor. "I want my money. All of it. By the end of the day, or so help me God, Robert, everyone in this town will know exactly what you are." He didn't wait for a response. He turned and stormed down the street, his back rigid. Mayor Thompson stood on the sidewalk for a long moment, his face ashen. He adjusted his tie, a pathetic, reflexive gesture of normalcy in a world that had just been tilted on its axis. He glanced at the diner, his eyes meeting mine for a split second. What I saw in them wasn't guilt or remorse. It was fear. The raw animal fear of a man who has been caught. He got in his car and drove away, not towards Town Hall, but in the direction of his secluded house on the edge of town. Sheriff Brody came back inside his face, grim. "Chloe, pour me another coffee," he said, his voice heavy. "It's going to be a long day." The diner was silent. The facade had cracked. Through that crack, we all had our first terrifying glimpse of the abyss that lay beneath the comfortable, predictable life of Willow Creek. The news of the confrontation would spread through town like wildfire, carried by whispers, phone calls, and fearful speculation. The first stone had been thrown, and the ripples were already turning into waves. The confrontation on the sidewalk was a spark in a tinderbox. Before Sheriff Brody had finished his second cup of coffee, the phone behind the counter started ringing. It was my boss, George. "Chloe, what in God's name is going on?" Martha just called me from the bakery. She said Frank Henderson threatened the mayor. "It wasn't exactly a threat, George," I said, trying to choose my words carefully. "He's lost his farm. He said the investment firm went bankrupt." There was a choked sound on the other end of the line. George had put nearly $60,000 into the revival fund. His entire retirement. "Bankrupt," he whispered. No, Bob said it was insured. He guaranteed it." The word guaranteed hung in the air, suddenly sounding naive and foolish. After I hung up with George, the diner door swung open again. It was a slow but steady stream of people, now not for food but for information. They came in ones and twos, the hardware store owner, the town librarian, two of the teachers from the elementary school. Their faces were tight with a new, specific kind of fear. The abstract worry of the morning had coalesced into a single, terrifying question. "Is our money gone?" They spoke in hushed, frantic tones. "Did you hear? Eleanor said the number was disconnected. I saw the man in the suit. He looked like a shark." Sheriff Brody did his best to quell the rising panic. "Let's not jump to conclusions," he kept saying, his voice a strained monotone. "I'm going to go have a word with Bob. Get this all straightened out." But when he left, he didn't head towards the mayor's house. He went to his office at the courthouse, a retreat from the storm rather than a move to confront it. His inaction was more damning than any accusation. Around 1:00 p.m. Ben Carter returned. He slid a folded, grease-stained piece of paper across the counter to me. "Found this on the floor of Henderson's truck when I was checking his oil last week," he said quietly. "Forgot I had it until all this kicked off. Figured you might be interested." I unfolded it. It was a crumpled prospectus for the Willow Creek Revival Fund, the same one the mayor had handed out at the town meeting. But scrawled in the margins in Frank's handwriting were notes. He'd done his own research. Next to Sterling Equity Partners, he'd written no public listing, registered to a P.O. box in Delaware. Next to the name of the fund manager, a Michael Vance, he'd written. No professional license found, possible alias. And at the bottom, a chilling final note. Call to old army buddy at SEC. Says firm has red flags all over it. A shell corp. Ask Bob directly. Frank hadn't just been suspicious, he'd been investigating. He had given the mayor the benefit of the doubt, wanting to believe in the man he'd known his whole life until the foreclosure notice had forced his hand. "He knew," I whispered, looking at Ben. "Or he suspected at least." "Looks like it," Ben said, his jaw tight. "And if he suspected, and Brody brushed him off, and the mayor lied to his face, what does that say about this town?" "Chloe." The question hung between us unanswered. The unraveling accelerated. Eleanor Gable, spurred by her earlier panic, had gone home and done what she did best: research. She wasn't just a historian of artifacts. She was a historian of deeds and documents. She called the county clerk's office about the old lumber mill property, the cornerstone of the mayor's proposed hotel development. At 2:30 p.m., she walked back into the diner, her face pale but her eyes blazing with a righteous fury. She didn't whisper this time. She spoke loud enough for the half-dozen anxious townspeople nursing cold coffee to hear. "The old lumber mill property," she announced, her voice trembling but clear. "It was never owned by the town. Robert Thompson never secured the rights to develop it." A collective gasp went through the room. "Who owns it then?" asked the hardware store owner. Eleanor took a deep breath. "According to the county deed, a private LLC purchased it 6 months ago. The LLC is registered to an address in the city. The name of the registered agent is Amelia Thompson." "The mayor's wife," someone breathed. "No," Eleanor said, her voice dropping. "His daughter. The one who lives in California." The silence in the diner was absolute. The lie wasn't just about a bad investment. It was a deeper, more personal betrayal. The mayor hadn't just lost their money. He had been actively moving pieces around a board, preparing to profit from the land, while their savings vanished into a phantom company. The hotel, the revitalization, the future he'd sold them, it was all a lie built on a foundation of their stolen money. The whispers turned into angry murmurs. The fear was calcifying into rage. People started pulling out their phones, calling neighbors' husbands, wives. The information spread from the diner like a virus, infecting every home and business in Willow Creek. The mayor had promised them a revival. What he had given them was a meticulously crafted mirage. And as the truth began to bleed out, the mirage evaporated, revealing the barren, ugly reality beneath. They hadn't been investing in their town. They had been paying for the mayor's escape plan. The unraveling was no longer a quiet process. It was a deafening roar, and it was getting louder by the minute. The revelation about the lumber mill property was the tipping point. The town's simmering anxiety boiled over into outright fury. The target was no longer some faceless firm named Sterling Equity, but a man they all knew, a man they had elected and trusted, Mayor Robert Thompson. A small crowd began to gather in the town square across from the diner. It started with a few of the people who had been inside, but their numbers swelled as the news spread. I saw the faces of my customers, people I'd served for years. I saw their confusion hardening into the grim certainty of betrayal. Then came the twist that implicated more than just the mayor. It was just after 300 p.m. Sheriff Brody's cruiser pulled up not at the courthouse but in front of the diner. He got out his face unreadable and walked inside. The place fell silent. "Chloe," he said, his voice low and tired, "I need to use your phone, the one behind the counter." "What's wrong with yours, Sheriff?" Ben asked from his stool, his tone edged with suspicion. "Just need to make a call. I don't want going through the official switchboard," Brody said, his eyes avoiding ours. It was a strange request, but I nodded. He squeezed behind the counter, his bulk making the small space feel even smaller. He dialed a number from memory. I tried to look busy wiping down a clean section of the counter, but I was listening with every fibre of my being. "It's Jim," he said into the receiver, his back to us. "Yeah, it's bad. No, he's not picking up. Listen to me. The whole thing with Sterling is out. Frank Henderson blew the lid off it this morning." There was a pause. Brody listened, his shoulders slumping. "Worse," he continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Eleanor Gable just found out about the mill property. The LLC. Amelia's name." Another pause, this one longer. I could hear a faint, frantic squawking from the earpiece. Then Brody said the words that changed everything. "Look, I told Bob this was a bad idea from the start. I told him it was too risky. But he swore he'd make everyone whole. I kept it quiet because he helped me out with Mary's medical bills last year. He gave me $20,000. Said it was a loan from a friend. I know where it came from now. I know." My blood ran cold. I risked a glance at Ben. His face was a mask of disbelief and disgust. "What do we do?" Brody asked the person on the phone. "The whole town is about to implode. No, I can't arrest him." "On what charge?" "Speculation. Bad judgment. It's his word against theirs until we see the bank records. And if he goes down, we all get pulled into it." He hung up the phone without saying goodbye. He stood for a moment, his back still to us. A man trapped. He had traded his integrity, his duty for a loan to help his sick wife. The mayor hadn't just bought his silence, he had bought his complicity. Our sheriff, the one man meant to uphold the law, was compromised. He was part of the rot. "Who was that?" Ben asked, his voice cold as steel. Brody turned around slowly. The weary lawman facade was gone, replaced by the face of a guilty, cornered man. "That's none of your business, son." "It is when you're using a private phone to discuss a town-wide fraud you helped cover up," Ben shot back. "You watch your mouth," Brody warned, his hand reflexively moving towards his hip. "Or what?" I found my voice anger cutting through my shock. "You'll arrest us." "For what?" "Listening to you confess. The mayor paid for your silence with our money. Didn't he Frank Henderson's money? George's money?" The sheriff stared at me, his eyes pleading. "You don't understand, Chloe. My wife, everyone has a story," I said, my voice trembling. "Frank's got a son who can't go to college. Eleanor and her husband have no retirement. Don't you dare hide behind your wife." He flinched as if I'd slapped him. Without another word, he pushed past Ben and walked out of the diner. He didn't get in his cruiser. He just walked down the street, away from the growing crowd, a man walking away from his own life. The betrayal was no longer singular. It was a web, a tangle. The mayor was the architect, but he had enablers. Sheriff Brody's silence bought and paid for. Who else? Who was on the other end of that phone call? The bank manager, a town council member. It didn't matter. The trust that held Willow Creek together wasn't just broken. It was a lie. It had been a lie for at least a year. The town hadn't been betrayed by one bad man. It had been poisoned from the inside by the quiet compromises and fearful silences of the people meant to protect it. The problem wasn't just Robert Thompson. The problem was the very fabric of the community, which had proven to be rotten to the core. The anger in the town square was no longer just for the mayor. It was for the entire system. They had believed in a system that had failed them at every level. The sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, casting long, distorted shadows across Main Street. The day was far from over. By 5:00 p.m., the crowd in the town square had become a mob. Not a violent one, not yet, but a mob nonetheless united by a singular, furious purpose. Their anger had a destination, the mayor's large, secluded house at the end of Sycamore Lane. The news of Sheriff Brody's complicity had spread like gasoline on the fire, passed from phone to phone, neighbor to neighbor. There was no one to stop them now. There was no authority left to trust. They started moving a grim procession, leaving the center of town. I watched them from the diner window. Ben stood beside me. "Are you coming?" he asked. I don't know," I said. I was a spectator, an outsider. This wasn't my fight. But then I thought of George, his voice trembling on the phone. I thought of Frank Henderson's face etched with a pain so deep it seemed ancient. This wasn't my money, but this was my town, for better or worse. This was the place I served coffee and listened to stories. I was a part of it whether I liked it or not. "Yeah," I said, untying my apron and dropping it on the counter. "I'm coming." We joined the back of the crowd. The walk to Sycamore Lane was eerily quiet. The anger had burned past the point of shouting. It had settled into a hard, dense resolve. The sky was a bruised purple, and the crows, which had been circling all day, were now roosting in the tall oaks that lined the road, their black shapes like silent judges. The mayor's house was a handsome, two-story colonial set back from the road with a manicured lawn. It was a house built to project success and stability. Tonight it looked like a fortress under siege. All the lights were on, blazing defiantly against the encroaching dusk. The crowd fanned out on the lawn, their faces illuminated by the windows. There was no plan. They just stood there, a human dam of fury waiting for something to break. Then the front door opened. It wasn't the mayor. It was his wife, Catherine Thompson, a woman known for her prize-winning roses and her quiet demeanor. She stood on the porch, her face a wreck of tears and terror. "Please," she begged, her voice thin and reedy. "Please just go home. You're scaring our children." From behind her, their teenage son and daughter peered out, their faces pale with confusion and fear. It was a calculated move, using the children as a shield. For a moment it worked. A wave of hesitation passed through the crowd. These were their kids' classmates, their friends. But then a voice cut through the silence. It was Frank Henderson. He pushed his way to the front of the crowd. He wasn't yelling anymore. His voice was eerily calm. "Our children are scared too, Catherine," he said, his words carrying in the still air. "They're scared because their college funds are gone. They're scared because their parents are losing their homes. We need to talk to your husband." "He's not here," she lied, her eyes darting nervously. But just as she spoke, a light flickered in an upstairs window. A silhouette passed by. The mayor was there. The lie was so blatant, so pathetic, that it shattered the last vestiges of sympathy the crowd might have had. "Get him out here," someone shouted from the back. The cry was picked up by others. "Thompson, face us." Suddenly, Frank Henderson did something that sent a shockwave through the crowd. He reached into the back of his jeans and pulled out an old, rusty hunting rifle. It wasn't pointed at anyone. He held it broken open over his arm, the barrel pointing at the ground. It wasn't a threat of violence. It was a symbol. It was the last desperate act of a man with nothing left to lose. The sight of the rifle changed the atmosphere from angry to volatile. People took a step back. Catherine Thompson screamed and pulled her children inside, slamming the door. And that's when the front door opened again. This time, it was Robert Thompson. He looked like a man who had aged 20 years in a single day. His suit was rumpled, his hair was disheveled, and his face was slick with sweat. He saw Frank. He saw the rifle. He saw the faces of the people he had known his entire life, now twisted into masks of hatred. "Frank." "Put the gun down," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "This," Frank said, looking down at the rifle as if he'd forgotten it was there. "This isn't for you, Robert. This is for me. It's the only thing the bank can't take. It's all I have left." The sheer hopelessness in his voice was more terrifying than any threat. The mayor's composure finally completely shattered. "You want to know why?" he screamed, his voice cracking, spittle flying from his lips. "You all want to know. Because this town is a graveyard. Because you were all happy to just sit here and die watching your kids leave and your businesses close. I tried to do something. I tried to build something. With our money," Eleanor Gable shrieked from the crowd. "Yes, with your money," he roared back, a wild, cornered look in his eyes. "Because none of you had the guts to risk it. You wanted the reward without the gamble. I took the gamble for you. It didn't work. It all fell apart. The market turned. The partners were crooks. It's gone. All of it. It's gone." He was sobbing now, great heaving gasps. "I was trying to save us. I was trying to save this pathetic, dying town." It was a confession, a justification, and a condemnation all at once. In that moment, he wasn't a monster. He was just a man, a weak and arrogant man, whose ambition had curdled into deceit. He had gambled with their lives and lost, and now he was trying to blame them for it. No one moved. No one spoke. They just stared at the broken man on the porch, the architect of their ruin. The confrontation wasn't a physical battle. It was a soul-crushing execution of a town's trust. All the lies were laid bare under the porch light. The full undiluted truth was out. The money was gone. There was no insurance. There was no hope of getting it back. There was nothing. Frank Henderson slowly lowered the rifle. He looked at the mayor, at the house, at the faces around him. Then he turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness. His departure was like a signal. The confrontation was over. There was nothing left to say. The mayor's confession hung in the air long after he had stumbled back inside and slammed the door. It was a final brutal truth that offered no comfort, no solution, only an ending. The crowd on his lawn didn't disperse with shouts or anger. They just dissolved. They broke apart in twos and threes, shuffling back down Sycamore Lane, not as a unified mob, but as a collection of broken individuals. The shared fury that had propelled them there was gone, replaced by the private, isolating grief of their own personal losses. Ben and I walked back to Main Street in silence. The energy of the day had been burned away, leaving a hollow exhaustion in its place. Night had fully fallen now, but Willow Creek was darker than I'd ever seen it. Half the streetlights were out, a budget cut from months ago that no one had paid much mind to. Now it felt symbolic. The town square was empty. The Creekside diner was dark. George had gone home, presumably to sit with the reality that his life's savings were now just a memory. I looked through the plate glass window at the familiar red vinyl booths and the checkered floor. This morning it had been the heart of the town. Now it was a tomb. No one is left standing. I whispered the words from the title of the story I was living through, finally making sense. It wasn't about physical death. It was about the complete collapse of the lives they had built. Mayor Thompson, once the most respected man in town, was now a prisoner in his own home. His name a curse. His family was destroyed, his children marked by his sins. He was still upright, but he was not standing. Sheriff Brody was a ghost. Later we would learn he'd driven to the next county, dropped his badge and gun on the desk of a stunned deputy, and simply walked away. His career was over, his reputation obliterated by a single compromising loan. He was not standing. Frank Henderson had lost his family's legacy, his land, his son's future. His desperate act with the rifle wasn't a show of strength, but the last twitch of a man already defeated. He was not standing. Eleanor Gable, the town's historian and gossip, had uncovered the truth. But what victory was there in that? Her knowledge brought no restitution, only confirmation of the ruin. Her retirement was gone. She and her husband would have to sell their antique shop, their life's passion. They were not standing. And it went on and on, rippling through every house. The teachers who couldn't afford to retire, the small business owners who now lacked the capital to restock their shelves, the young families whose down payments for homes had vanished. Friendships were shattered. Those who had been skeptical were now resentfully vindicated, and those who had been enthusiastic proponents of the fund were now pariahs of bad advice. Neighbor turned from neighbor, the shared trauma creating suspicion instead of unity. Who knew who was complicit? The trust was gone, and a community without trust is just a collection of houses. Ben walked me to the small apartment I rented above the bakery. "What are you going to do now, Chloe?" he asked, his voice low. "I don't know," I said honestly. "My escape fund is still under my bed. I guess I'm one of the lucky ones." The words felt bitter in my mouth, lucky to have been too poor to be ruined. "Maybe we could try to fix this," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "People could what, Ben?" I asked, the exhaustion making me sharp. "Rebuild with what?" "The bank will own half the town by Christmas. The other half will be for sale. There's nothing to fix. It's over." He had no answer. He just nodded the dim light from a working streetlight, catching the profound sadness in his eyes. He wasn't from here, but he had tried to make it his home. Now that home had ceased to exist, he wasn't standing either. I went upstairs and locked my door. The silence from the street below was the most unsettling part. No cars, no distant laughter, no hum of a town settling in for the night. It was the dead silence of a place that had lost its soul. I looked out my window at the darkened silhouette of the town. The crows were gone. They had flown low that morning, harbingers of a doom that had already been set in motion. They had watched the town tear itself apart, feast on its own heart, until by nightfall nothing was left. Not a single person in Willow Creek was left standing. They had all been brought down, not by a storm or a fire, but by the quiet, corrosive power of a single, well-told lie. Dawn broke on Friday, September the 13th, with an indifferent grey light that seemed to suck the colour from the world. The promised rain had never come. Instead, the sky was a blank, oppressive canvas. I woke up on my lumpy sofa, a crick in my neck, the events of the previous day, replaying in my mind not as a sharp memory, but as a dull, throbbing ache. For a few blessed seconds, my mind was blank, and Willow Creek was just a sleepy town waking up. Then the memory of the confrontation of Mayor Thompson's screaming confession of Frank Henderson's dead eyes crashed down on me with a physical weight. I forced myself to the window and looked down onto Main Street. It was deserted, but not in the peaceful way of an early morning. This was a different kind of emptiness, a profound and unnerving vacuum where life used to be. Then I saw it, propped in the front window of Nelson's Hardware, where old Mr. Nelson usually displayed lawn mowers and seasonal decorations, was a hand-painted sign. The letters were crude and shaky, written in what looked like house paint for sale. By owner. Will consider any offer. That sign was the first white flag of surrender, the first crack in the dam that would soon break entirely. As I watched the door to the bakery below me creaked open, and Martha, its owner, propped a similar, smaller sign in her own window before disappearing back into the shadows. The exodus had begun. My phone buzzed on the coffee table, the sound unnaturally loud in the silence. It was a text from my boss, George. Chloe. I'm sorry. I have to close the diner. The bank called this morning. I'm broke. The key is under the mat if you need to get anything. Good luck. The finality of it, the simple declarative sentences, hit me harder than I expected. The diner had been my stage, my listening post, the predictable rhythm of my life. Now it was just another casualty. There was no decision to be made. My dream of leaving had become a necessity. I started to pack. It didn't take long. I didn't own much. A few changes of clothes, some worn paperbacks, the trinkets of a life lived in waiting. I pulled the shoebox from under my bed. The escape fund. I emptied the crumpled bills and coins onto my mattress, the sum of 2 years of tips. It had always felt like a symbol of hope, a ticket to a future I would choose. Now, looking at the meager pile of cash, it felt like salvage. It was the purse of a shipwreck survivor. A profound guilt washed over me. I was getting out. My small, insignificant dreams were intact, because I'd been too poor to have them stolen. Before leaving, I felt an urge I couldn't explain. I had to see the diner one last time. I went downstairs, the key from under the mat cold in my hand. Inside, the air was stale with the smell of old coffee and cold grease. The silence was absolute. No clatter of plates, no hiss of the grill, no murmur of conversation. I walked behind the counter, my fingers tracing the worn laminate. On the pass-through, a single order slip for Frank Henderson's last coffee remained. At the end of the counter, Sheriff Brody's crossword puzzle lay abandoned half-finished, a testament to a life interrupted mid-thought. This place had been the heart of the town. Now it was just a room full of ghosts. I took one of the heavy ceramic mugs as a memento, a solid piece of a life that had evaporated. Locking the door behind me, I took a final walk down Main Street. Through the large window of Gable's Antiques, I could see Eleanor and her husband moving like automatons. They were wrapping delicate porcelain figurines in old newspaper, not with the care of merchants, but with the grim efficiency of people packing up evidence from a crime scene. Their life's collection, their passion, reduced to inventory for liquidation. A breeze rustled down the empty street, carrying a single piece of paper with it. It tumbled end over end before coming to rest against my shoe. I bent down and picked it up. It was one of Mayor Thompson's glossy flyers for the Willow Creek Revival Fund. A picture of a smiling family, superimposed over an artist's rendering of the never-to-be-built hotel. Invest in your future. Invest in Willow Creek. The lie felt so loud, even on a silent piece of paper. I crumpled it in my fist. I saw him then standing by his old pickup truck outside the auto shop, a duffel bag at his feet. Ben Carter. He was watching me, his expression unreadable. "I see you're raiding the ruins," he said, nodding toward the mug in my hand. "Just taking my severance," I replied, trying for a lightness I didn't feel. "You too?" I asked, gesturing to his bag. He gave a sad, wry smile. "There are no cars left to fix when no one has the money to pay for gas." The owner called this morning. He's selling the shop for parts. Thought I'd head west. See what's out there. What about Willow Creek? I asked the question, feeling stupid as soon as I said it. What happens to it? It becomes a ghost town, he said, his voice flat. It'll die a slow death. In a year, it'll be a few old-timers who had nothing to lose and a bunch of bank-owned properties. It's a cautionary tale for tourists who get lost on the highway. The town that believed a bedtime story. He kicked at a loose piece of gravel. You know the fatal flaw here wasn't greed, Chloe. It was faith. They had too much of it. They believed in a man in a community so completely that they couldn't see the wolf standing right in front of them dressed in a shepherd's clothes. We could see it, you and I, because we were never really part of it. We were lucky. We stood there for a long moment, two outsiders who had been granted front-row seats to the apocalypse. We were the only ones with the freedom to simply leave. For everyone else, leaving meant abandoning the wreckage of their entire lives. Good luck, Chloe Peterson, he said, extending a hand. His grip was firm, a last moment of solid reality in a town that had become a mirage. You too, Ben Carter. He climbed into his truck, the engine turning over with a familiar rumble. He didn't look back as he drove off, heading west into the blank grey morning. I was truly alone on Main Street. I loaded my 2 bags and the coffee mug into my beat-up sedan. The engine whined in protest before catching. As I pulled away from the curb, I began the final tour. I drove past Sycamore Lane, a police car now parked at the entrance, a quiet guard against a threat that no longer existed. The mayor's house looked smaller, the curtains all drawn a self-imposed prison of shame. I passed Frank Henderson's farm, the foreclosure notice on his gate already peeling in the wind, a tombstone for a stolen legacy. I saw the church, the school, the small landmarks of a life I was now leaving behind, forever each one tainted by the memory of yesterday. The last thing I saw was the Welcome to Willow Creek sign, the one that boasted a community built on trust. Someone had taken a can of black spray paint to it. They had violently crossed out the word welcome, and underneath the official town slogan in dripping, furious letters, they had scrawled a single damning word, liars. I pressed my foot down on the accelerator, my eyes fixed on the rear-view mirror. I watched until the sign, the town, the entire sorry chapter of my life, was nothing more than a small, insignificant speck in the vast, empty landscape. By nightfall, no one in Willow Creek was left standing, and by the next morning, those of us who could walk were already gone, leaving the ghosts to argue amongst themselves. The story of Willow Creek is more than just a tale of financial ruin. It's a chilling reminder of how fragile the foundations of a community truly are. It shows how trust built over generations can be shattered in a single day by greed, deceit, and the quiet complicity of those who choose to look away. Willow Creek wasn't destroyed by a faceless corporation or a market crash. It was devoured from within by the very people who called it home. Its tragedy serves as a stark warning. The monsters we should fear most are often the ones who share our coffee, lead our parades, and promise us a brighter future. If this story of how a town fell resonated with you, please take a moment to hit the like button. Share this cautionary tale with others, because the lessons of Willow Creek are universal. And be sure to subscribe to my channel for more deep dives into the dramas that unfold just beneath the surface of our everyday lives. Thank you for listening.